Hello everyone and welcome to the very first tutorial on this channel. In this video I'm going to show you how I created this pretty versatile projectile system. By the end of this video you will have a system where you can create almost any trajectory you can think of. You can very easily change the projectile curvature, the projectile speed and its speed variation along its trajectory, the trajectory shape, for example for this fire mage, and you can even get super creative like for this ice mage. And this system can work for 2D side-scrolling games as well as for top-down view games. I created this system for my game Hidden Tactics. This is my very first Steam game I'm working on. It's a PvP turn-based tactical auto battler, and I was very happy with the projectile system I created for this game. I think these archer arrow volleys look really cool, as well as these artillery shots, catapults or cannons. If you're curious about my game, feel free to head to the Steam page, I'll put the link in the description. It's going to feature 4 different fantasy factions and so many cool units and buildings, from cavalry to giants and samurais, as well as rat swarms, and of course the dragon. And if that's a game you could be interested about, you can always add it to your wishlist. This really helps me to climb the Steam algorithm. Anyways, let's get to work now. So in this first chapter we're going to see how to instantiate the projectiles from a shooter object and make these projectiles reach a target object. If you're already familiar with this step, here are my shooter and projectile script. You can head straight over to step 2. So our initial scene here is composed of 2 objects, a archer object and a target object. Those are basically empty objects with sprite renderers in their child game object. Let's start by creating a new script for the archer, and let's call it the shooter script. Attach it to the archer object and open it up. So what we're going to need first is a reference to our projectile prefab. We're also going to need a reference to our target. In this tutorial we're just going to shoot at a given rate, so let's make 2 floats for timers. And on update, let's count down our timer and instantiate our projectile when it reaches 0. Now back to our project, serialize our target, let's make it fire every second. So let's start by creating a projectile prefab. Let's create an empty game object, call it projectile, reset the transform, and drag it in the prefabs folder. Now if you open the projectile prefab, let's create 2 empty child game objects, so a projectile visual and a projectile shadow. Both of these need a sprite renderer. Pick up our sprite. So in my case, it's this little boy here. And let's pick up the same sprite for the shadow. We're not going to wonder about the shadow right now. We'll see how this works later. And straight away, let's create a new script for our projectile. Let's attach our script to our projectile and open it up. So what our projectile needs is, first of all, a reference to the target, a move speed, and for the moment, that's it. On update, we're just going to make our projectile move towards our target. So transform that position, plus equals, and we need to calculate a move gear normalized equals target that position minus transform that position normalized, and transform that position equals move gear normalized times move speed. I did the noobest mistake here, don't be a noob like me. Don't forget to multiply this by time.delta time. Of course, we want to destroy the projectile once it reaches the target. So there are multiple ways to do this. It's not really important in this tutorial, so if the distance to our target is less than a certain amount, I just destroy the projectile. We don't like these kind of numbers in general in clean code, so we can just go for a private float distance to target to destroy projectile with this 2 1f. Now we have our projectile moving, but we still need to set the target. Let's actually go for a public void initialize projectile with a transform target and a float move speed. Let's go for this dot target equals target, this dot move speed equals move speed. Now we're going to call initialize projectile from our shooter script. Let's reference our projectile equals this one, component of type projectile, and let's go for projectile dot initialize projectile target. We need a new parameter for our projectile move speed. But there we go, save our scripts. So our shooter here needs a projectile move speed. Let's just set this to 5 or 10. We now need the projectile prefab and drag the reference to our target. Let's press play and see what happens. Okay, so we have a very simple script here, and the projectiles, as you can see, follow the target. Let's now add some curve to our projectile. So back in our shooter script, for our curve, we're going to use a tool from Unity called an animation curve. Now that we've serialized this curve, we can see it right there. And let's start with a very simple bell curve. This curve is on the shooter script and we want to pass it on to the projectile script. So we're going to create a reference to that curve here. And we're going to make another initialization function. So this function takes in an animation curve and sets this animation curve to the one it receives. Now back to our shooter script, let's just pass on the animation curve from the shooter to the projectile. And this is where it gets slightly more complex. Let's start by creating a function to update the projectile position. We don't need this anymore because we're going to create a whole new system. Alright, so what we're going to do in the next couple steps is to calculate the y position of our projectile based on its x position. Because the curve is normalized between 0 and 1 on both axes, first thing we have to do is to calculate the trajectory range, which is the distance between our trajectory endpoint and our trajectory start point. So let's set the trajectory start point to where the projectile is instantiated in the start function. Because the trajectory's endpoint might change in this case, we're going to recalculate the trajectory range in the update function. Another mistake here, it's not the transform position, it's the target's position. So now we can calculate the projectile's next position on the x-axis. We then want to normalize this value between 0 and 1 using the trajectory range we calculated previously. We can then use the evaluate function in the animation curve in order to calculate our y position normalized. And finally, we want to turn this normalized y position into an absolute y position. Now for this we need a value for the trajectory maximum height, so let's set this in the initialize function. And back in the shooter script, let's create a new serialized field for our projectile max height and pass it in the initialization function. Another small mistake here, you have to add the trajectory start point y position in the next y position. It all comes down to setting the absolute value of the animation curve's y-axis origin. Now that we have the absolute x and y position for our projectile, we can just create a new vector 3 called next position and set it on our transformed out position. Here we go! And as you can see, as I increase the max height, goes up higher. And if I decrease it, it goes lower. One thing I realized here is that if I bring my shooter closer to the target, or on the opposite, if I bring it way further, the maximum Y position of the projectile does not change, and that doesn't look really good. So what I did to handle that is that instead of having an absolute trajectory max height, we have a relative height. And this relative height will be dependent on the distance to the target on the x-axis. So now we're going to need to set this way lower, but at least when we bring it closer, well, now it's responsive, you see. Same if we bring it way further, we have a real curve now. Okay, so we have our basic curve now, but you'll realize that it doesn't go exactly to our target. And this is where we need another curve. So back to our shooter script where we created the first animation curve, call it the axis correction animation curve. And we're going to pass it in Now we want this correction to start at 0. So you see we're going to use the y-axis differential between both our targets. And here, our axis animation correction curve is going to be a straight line. We want it to start at 0, and at the end here is going to be our y-axis differential here. Back on our projectile script, we're going to have a float next position y correction equals our axis correction animation curve that evaluates our next position x normalized. That's going to be a normalized value, and what we actually want is an absolute value . And now our next position y, start point plus this, and let's add our next position y correction absolute value. And let's try it out. Now if I move my archer, there we go. Projectile is indeed fully targeting the orc. Great. Now we're going to need a third curve, which is the speed curve. So this one is going to be pretty easy if you've understood the two first curves. Create a new curve for the speed, and just as the two previous curves, pass it into the projectile through the initialization function. Let's create a new function to calculate our projectile speed. Our new projectile speed for an arrow, it's basically a U-shaped curve because it shoots pretty fast, right? Then it reaches the top and then it goes back down. To exaggerate it here, let's put it up to 0.2, you see. Now this works exactly the same as with the previous curves. We're going to calculate a move speed based on the normalized X position. So that will hand us a normalized move speed between 0 and 1, and then we want to turn it into an absolute value using a new parameter called max move speed. We need max move speed, but this is not move speed anymore, it's max move speed. Just for the sake of clarity, we're going to rename this max move speed, and in the shooter here, max move speed. Okay, so don't forget to set it back here. Let's push it up to 40. Here, you see, it's a very exaggerated curve. It's just to illustrate my purpose. You'd probably want to have this around 0.7. And you can play around with this curve to have the speed variation you want for your projectile. I forgot to record that, but if you try bringing your shooter to the opposite side of your target, you'll realize it doesn't work. So to fix that, we just need to reverse the move speed whenever we're in that situation. So we already have a lot done. So now let's make that projectile look good with a rotation and a shadow. So let's start by creating a new script called Projectile Visual. Let's open up that script and straight away make two references, one for our projectile visual transform and one for our projectile shadow transform. We can also straight away create a reference to our projectile. We're going to start by handling the rotation. Let's create that function. This one's going to be actually very simple to do. We're going to need the move direction from the projectile. So in the projectile script, let's create a new vector 3 for our move direction. And right before updating our position, we can calculate our projectile move direction. Now we need this move direction in our projectile visual script. So let's make a simple getter function. And let's fetch it from the projectile visual script. Now to make the projectile face the direction it's moving, we're going to use a quaternion function, and to be completely honest with you, I'm not very confident about quaternions, so I will not explain how this function works. There are plenty of tutorials about quaternions if you want to dive deeper on that subject, but if like me you just want to use the function, well, just follow along. And for now, let's apply the exact same function to the shadow. Back in the editor in our projectiles prefab, let's drag in the projectile visual script and all our references. So now we can just press play. There we go. So that's for the rotation. Now back in our projectile visual script, let's create a new function to update the projectile shadow position. I'm calculating the trajectory range on the shadow. We don't actually need it right now, but we'll need it for the next step, so you can still follow along. So to get our trajectory range, we need the trajectory start point that we're setting on start and the target that we're going to set from the projectile script. Back in our projectile script, to set the target, we need a reference to the projectile visual. And we can set it when we initialize the projectile from the shooter script. We now have everything to calculate our trajectory range. Now for the shadow position, we actually want it to be a bit lower than the actual projectile position. And for that, we need to recalculate the projectile trajectory. Because there are three components in the projectile's trajectory: the start position, the new Y position calculated with the animation curve, and the Y-axis correction. The parameter we want to modify to change the shadow position is the evaluated position from the animation curve. So we need each of these components separately. So let's start by creating a new vector 3, new position, set it to the transform.position. Then we're going to change the Y component of this new position. So now we need to fetch these parameters from our projectile script. So we need to declare these parameters outside the function. Okay. So remove the float from the next Y position correction absolute. And then I'm combining the next position Y normalized times the trajectory max relative height in a single variable next Y trajectory position. Then we can finally make two getter functions and we're done. Well, almost. We just have to recalculate the projectile shadow position. Now this is where we can finally divide the shadow's next Y trajectory position by a certain amount. Don't forget to drag your projectile visual reference, and on your projectile shadow, you can change its color to black. You can also reduce its opacity, that can look good. I also like to change the scale on the Y-axis slightly to make it thinner. And of course, the sprite sorting order, set it behind the projectile sprite, so -1 for example. Our projectile shadow is almost done. It looks good, but as you can see, there's something off with the rotation. What I like to do is update the shadow's rotation only until a certain point in the trajectory. You don't have to do this, it's really just personal preference, but I'll still show you how I did. So first of all, let's split the projectile rotation update function and the shadow rotation update function. And then what I do is calculate the normalized progress of the projectile in its trajectory. And then I update the shadow's rotation only when this normalized progress is under a certain amount. And now you'll see that the shadow rotation only updates at the beginning of the curve, which in my opinion looks better. Now for the moment this system is limited to 2D side-scrolling games, as we are only working on the y-axis for the projectile's trajectory. Now in the next chapter we'll see how we can modify this system to make it work on both the y and x-axis. So let's start by identifying the quadrants where the system is not optimal. This occurs when the x value of the trajectory range is smaller than its y value. So let's translate that condition in our script. And now let's encapsulate our existing system in a function that's only relative to the prediction of the trajectory on the y-axis. Don't forget to move the condition for the move speed, as it's only relative to this function. And now if you try pressing play, you will notice that there is no more trajectory in the 4 quadrants that were previously identified. It only works for the prediction of the trajectory on the y-axis. So now let's create the function to evaluate the trajectory on the x-axis. So here I'm just copying and pasting our existing system, and I'm literally reversing the system. So every x in this function becomes a y, and every y becomes an x. You can already create some new flows for the next x trajectory position and the correction for that x position. Don't do like me and forget some x or y's. So if you press play now, you'll see that the system is working on one of the 4 quadrants. On another, it's acting weird, and on the 2 others, we have the same problem as previously. So to fix these 2 quadrants, we're basically going to use the same condition as previously and reverse the move speed when the trajectory range.y is negative. So now the arrow trajectory is functional on 2 quadrants. And on the 2 others, the trajectory is basically reversed on the x-axis, so that's what we're going to handle now. So how we handle that is basically on these 2 quadrants we want to reverse the next x trajectory position. Okay, so the trajectory for the projectile is now functional on all 4 quadrants. Let's handle the shadow now. So back in our projectile visual script, we're basically creating the exact same conditions as in our projectile script. Now we just need to fetch the next x trajectory position and the next x correction. Copy the shadow's formula to calculate its next position and replace the x's by y's and the y's by x's. And here we go. When you press play, you'll notice you now have a functional projectile system for each of the 4 quadrants. Well done! Now to make it look even better, you can also add a trail renderer. I won't be detailing this process right here, but you'll find plenty of good tutorials on YouTube. So now you can play around with the different parameters in the editor to make it fit your projectile and your game. If you found this tutorial useful, let me know in the comments. This is my very first tutorial, so every piece of feedback is appreciated. If you like the assets I'm using in this video, you can grab the full MiniFantasy collection through the link in the description at an unbeatable price. Check out my game Hidden Tactics through the link in the description, and of course go wild on these projectiles.